Get into the Gilded Age. If you are one of my students or you read American Yop as your textbook, here are the page numbers that's coming from volume 2, and here are the key terms this video will go over today. So let's just get right into it and look at how the chapter opens with the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, also known as the Great Upheaval. So in the late 1870s, when the economy was struggling, railroad workers began to protest wage cuts and also unsafe working conditions. And because these strikes were taking place nationwide, it was shutting down railroad traffic. So consider the economic impact, given that the railroads during this period of American history are essentially the country's economic circulatory system, right? Strikes were often met with violent resistance from the police, also state militia, and after a certain point, President Hayes ended up sending federal troops into areas where either those local or state militias were unsuccessful or when they were unwilling to comply. Strikers often also engaged in acts of sabotage, such as destroying or burning railroad property, and there are several examples in American Yop from Pittsburgh and Reading, Pennsylvania, St. Louis, and Chicago, and it also gets into how there were casualties during this event. Approximately 100 Americans lost their lives during this great national railroad strike. And as far as the economic cost was concerned, about $40 million of property was destroyed. And if we adjust that for inflation, that is just shy of $1 billion as of 2020. From then on, employers ended up relying on federal and state troopers, I don't know if state troopers were a thing yet, but state troops, to repress labor unrest, and businesses ended up also vying for more political support, and workers also turned to politics, and they increasingly fought for their right to unionize, and we'll get into unions in a little while. Let's just look generally at some facts and figures about the rising gap between the rich and the poor. So by 1890, the richest 9% of Americans had about 75% of the national wealth. The average worker earned only a few $100s a year, and many workers resented the extravagant lifestyles of factory owners and railroad owners and the super wealthy, of course. That resentment was much greater. Workers often became politically active, and many of them were drawn to the ideas of socialism. And we'll get into that in more detail, but in short, it's an economic and political philosophy that favors public instead of private control of property and income. And socialists also believe that society at large, not just private individuals, should control a nation's wealth. So that wealth, they believe, should be distributed more evenly to everyone. And hopefully you get a second to just analyze some of the information you're seeing in terms of the division of labor and in terms of the divide between different economic classes. Note how small the middle class is here, by the way. All right, let's talk about some of the proponents of social Darwinism. So these two men are the most famous folks associated with this doctrine, and we'll start with Herbert Spencer. He coined the term social Darwinism. He was an Englishman, and he was a philosopher, and he believed in the ideas of laissez-faire capitalism, otherwise known as a free market economy. So he believed that the government should not interfere with the economy. He believed essentially that survival of the fittest, the ideas that were championed by Charles Darwin, the evolutionary biologist, also could apply to human beings. And unlike Darwin, Spencer also believed that individuals genetically pass on their learned characteristics to their children, and this meant that the most fittest folks inherited positive qualities such as intelligence and the desire to own property and the ability to accumulate wealth. On the other hand, the unfit inherited laziness, stupidity, and immorality was their fault. And this is, of course, according to Spencer. These are not my words. And Spencer also argued that the number of unfit would literally disappear over time because they were unable to effectively compete with the fit. And so, to put it into biological terms, Spencer believed that the poor, the undeserving, would eventually go extinct. Okay? And on this slide, you see a series of things that social Darwinists supported and opposed. And so just think about how, when workers start to fight for reforms, how folks who believe in social Darwinism are going to respond. Really, really quick on the other gentleman here, William Sumner. I don't believe he's related to Charles Sumner, by the way, but I could be wrong. He praised the new class of industrial millionaires, so folks like Andrew Carnegie. Sumner also argued that social progress depended on the fittest families passing that wealth to the next generation. He, just like Spencer, was a huge proponent of laissez-faire economics, and he too believed that the government should play no role in the economy. And further, he thought that any type of interference by reform groups would hinder natural selection. Okay, so that's, I think, essentially it. It occurred to me that I also put the term gospel of wealth on this slide. I don't know if that was mentioned in the reading or not. I don't remember. But in general, it's also important for us to realize that evangelical Christianity and just religion in general plays into the ideas of social Darwinism and just laissez-faire economics in general. Some folks believed, just like religious folks believe in providence or destination, and again, this is not everyone. Puritans believe in predestination. You already know that. Some folks believe that people who were rich because they deserved it, right? And so all of that is also somewhat intertwined with religion. Okay, great. So let's look a little bit at some terms, again, that are thrown around to associate with some individuals. And forgive me, my cat wants to go out, and I'm going to try to record and let her out at the same time. Okay, so robber barons is one of the terms. All right, here we go. Let's go. Robber barons. That is not a term that these folks would give to themselves. Robber barons is a term that was given by people who did not like these individuals, right? And so folks who did not like the super rich believed that they were stealing from the working class, right? That the wealth that was accumulated by folks like Andrew Carnegie and J.P. Morgan happened because of the poor's back-breaking labor. And other folks praised people like Morgan or Rockefeller or Carnegie and called them captains of industry. They said that those folks were entirely deserving of their wealth because their innovations were led to ultimately this explosion of wealth and growth and industrialization in not just the United States but the world. And so you can sort of see the different perspectives about these individuals. Let's talk about individuals who believed in labor activism. So arguably the most famous socialism in all of American history, one might say Bernie Sanders is up there as well, was Eugene V. Debs. So by the time the 1877 railroad strike took place, railroad workers mainly organized into small brotherhoods. They were essentially craft unions, which, if you're a European history person, you might refer to them as guilds. They are groups of people who have the same type of job, and what Eugene V. Debs proposes is to have a larger industrial union for all railway workers across the country. And this materializes into the American Railway Union, also known as the ARU. And the ARU eventually replaces all those smaller brotherhoods and unites all railroad workers, skilled and unskilled. We're not finished with Eugene V. Debs. We'll come back to him more when we explain socialism in more detail. And then to the right, you have Terence Powderly. I might add he has a pretty impressive mustache, but he led the Knights of Labor. And the Knights of Labor urged workplace cooperation, so very similar to the ARU. And they began to advocate for the 8-hour workday. And they were quite appealing to some folks who were excluded from craft unions, particularly because craft unions tended to be groups of skilled workers. And so unskilled workers, women, and also people of color were more included in the Knights of Labor than some of the craft unions that predated them. Okay, and let's see. Let's talk a little bit about the AFL and the IWW now. Okay, so the American Federation of Labor, that was founded, and that's also called the AFL, that was founded by the guy down here, Samuel Gompers. And this organized workers, again, it I don't believe included unskilled workers or women or folks of color, not to my knowledge. So it also focused on shorter term goals. It did focus on higher wages and shorter hours. It believed in collective bargaining, so it has that in common with other labor organizations. It did not believe in direct confrontation. So what that means is they were not willing to do things like strike. And this, I would argue, it was one of the more moderate labor organizations at the time, and this one gained more respect and esteem from the government than some of these other more radical ones did. Okay, the last one here, the IWW, was not mentioned in last night's reading, but I just want to bring it up because it's interesting in the sense that this is a global one. So the industrial workers of the world, right? There are many, many activists also in Europe fighting for the same things at the same time. So they emphasize an idea called solidarity. And that's, again, I want to emphasize the global component, that this is something where workers all across the world, right, believe that if they band together, they will be able to achieve more of their goals to improve their working conditions. So that international solidarity is key. Solidarity across different demographics is key, right? So things like the color of your skin, your gender, your nation of origin, the language you speak, those things, according to people that would join the IWW, should not be barriers to organization. They did believe in direct confrontation, so they often engaged in strikes. They also were more political than some of these other folks, particularly the folks in the AFL, and many of them were attracted to the Socialist Party. And again, we'll get more into that later. And then this chart just shows you the growth in labor activity during the late 19th century and the early 20th century. Okay, I don't want to take time interpreting these political cartoons, so feel free to pause and do so yourself. But just really interesting stuff here. This is interesting because you see that strike activity, even though the major ones are all located in urban areas, you do see that these strikes are not unique just to cities. And we'll get into more rural labor activity when we talk about the populace in a future video. A scab, I believe, is mentioned in the reading. That is a derogatory term for a strike breaker. These are folks who report to work during a strike. Some scabs were actually hired by the companies themselves. And if one person or two people or three people started to break a strike and show up to work, it was harder for that strike to continue. And my apologies, this was actually a duplication of the map on the other slide. Didn't catch that. These are just two really interesting images, and I encourage you to pause and think about what these two are representing. It's interesting to, sorry, my mouse just keeps doing that. It's interesting to think maybe about the perspective of the person who created this newspaper cover. And it's also interesting to note that this is written in two languages. So we know, again, from things like solidarity, that many folks, including immigrants, were attracted to the ideas of labor organization. And so this shows us the attempt to be inclusive when organizing a labor-related activity. So this period, if we go back to that captains of industry idea, is also important in terms of technological innovations. There's a lot of technological progress during this time period, and I just want to zero in on a couple really, really interesting details here. So one thing that's important to realize is that patents, which is basically protecting one's intellectual property, applying for a patent so someone else cannot steal that idea, these escalate during this time period, I believe. Yep, we'll look at that in a second, but patents are going to escalate rapidly in the late 19th century. It's important for us to realize that historians actually debate the original inventors of many technological innovations. Just because a person patented something, does that mean that they invented it? Is an interesting question that some of you might want to explore in the research you're going to do this unit. We know that Alexander Graham Bell received the patent for the first telephone in 1876. This was a model of it, pretty cool looking. The typewriter, the first commercial brand typewriter, went on the market sometime in the 1870s, and that's also interesting because of job opportunities it presented to women. I'll get into that more in a moment. And also electricity. You see the first incandescent light bulbs come about in the 1870s, and you see them down here. And what's interesting about that is, although yes, of course, that marks progress, where would we be without the light bulb? It also allows businesses to stay open after dark, and thus potentially has an adverse effect on working conditions. Oh, and this bicycle, that's just a patent image. I don't know anything about this bike, but it's interesting because it's an electric bicycle. And it's 1897. That's crazy. Okay, so again, note how much patents skyrocket during this period. Okay, just showing us how many more people have telephones in their households. Again, I said I was going to touch upon the impact typewriters have on women. So the typewriter opened up new jobs for women because they became more widely used. The typewriters, not women, although one could say women too, were more used in businesses during the mid-1880s. Sorry, it's been a long week. I'm making silly jokes. In 1881, the YWCA, which was, sorry, that's my cat, the YWCA in New York City offered a typing course for women, and these were the first white-collar jobs for women. And by 1888, the number of women employed as typists grew to 60,000, and these jobs led to women pursuing other white-collar careers as well. You might want to pause and just look at these images here while I let my poor, pathetic 16-year-old cat in. Stop crying. This is really interesting, this typewriter here. Remington, that's actually a company from Bridgeport, Connecticut, not too far from where I came from before I moved out to Los Angeles. And this is just an ad attempting to hire secretaries. Okay, I believe we're almost coming to the end here. So let's talk about the Haymarket Affair. So this took place in 1886. It started on May 1st. A group of workers decided to mount a national demonstration for an 8-hour workday. And in Chicago on May 3rd, a group of police officers broke up a fight that was taking place between strikers and scabs, strikebreakers. And union leaders decided to arrange a protest rally the following day in a neighborhood in Chicago called Haymarket Square. And a group of anarchists decided to join the strikers. Anarchists are political radicals who oppose all government whatsoever. And at the event, a bomb detonated. And we do not know for sure where that bomb came from. Nonetheless, there was a riot that followed, and dozens were killed, both the strikers and also strike breakers. So folks on multiple sides of this conflict ended up losing their lives. And investigators ultimately never found the person who threw that bomb, but yet 8 anarchists were arrested for conspiracy, and 4 of them were hanged. And so you see, this poster is calling them martyrs. So you can see that this is a poster that is sympathetic to those anarchists. And what else? The Homestead strike. This was mentioned in the reading. It's not a key term, but just really quickly zeroing in. This took place in Homestead, Pennsylvania, which is about 7 miles outside of Pittsburgh. And in 1892, Andrew Carnegie, his partner, Henry Frick, attempted to cut the wages of the workers at the Carnegie Steel factory. And the union at that factory called a strike, and Frick decided to call in Pinkertons, and those were private contractors that were hired to break up strikes. Also the name of a really good Weezer album, but you're probably too young to know that. Listen to it. Often those Pinkertons used force. Also, the union called off the Homestead strike eventually because an anarchist attempted to assassinate Frick, and they did not want that kind of violence. And even though that anarchist was not connected to the strike, the public associated his act with the rising labor violence. So nationally, folks who were not directly involved did not look particularly kindly upon these strikers. And in Pullman, oh gosh, where was Pullman? Illinois, I believe. Yes, Illinois. These were also strikes against wage cuts for workers in the Pullman Railroad Company. They created luxury railroad cars, sleeper cars often, for passengers who were taking long-distance train routes. And Eugene V. Debs, you see him again here, we already discussed him earlier, and the American Railway Union decided to launch a sympathy strike with Pullman all across the country. And that, again, just like that great railway strike in 1877, severely stunted American railway traffic. Debs, interestingly, instructed strikers to not interfere with the circulation of mail. So that's just interesting. One could ask, is that so that they can continue their own correspondence by mail, or if that is if there are other reasons why? It's just a very interesting detail I always was curious about. Further, American railway owners tried to turn to the government for help, again, just like in that 1877 strike. The governor of Illinois, interestingly, refused to send state militia to break up the strike, so President Grover Cleveland sent federal soldiers instead, again, just like Hayes did in 1877. Eugene V. Debs ultimately was arrested and imprisoned, but when he was incarcerated, he continued to gain followers, and increasingly, workers relied on striking as a means to achieve their goals. And Debs will come back up later, by the way, so I hope this was informative. I hope this was interesting. These next couple of charts here are just, unfortunately, not super recent, but giving us a sense of more current labor union activity. So this is just giving us a sense of some of the different benefits that workers have both collectively bargained for and now ultimately receive. But this is very old. I literally graduated from college in 2006. So I'll have to grab some more recent charts to look at later if you are all interested. And then this is also showing us labor organization or labor membership rather, up until the end of the 20th century. So again, you see, even though there's a slight increase by the turn of the century, it's a pretty precipitous decline, especially in the 1970s when there was an increase in, actually I should say a decrease in regulation of the economy. And we're seeing that happen again today. So if we were to look at more recent charts, even though there has been a movement over the past couple of years for workers to collectively bargain and increase union activity in general in the first 20 years or so of the 21st century, we've also seen a decline in labor activity. And this is showing us right to work and non-right to work states. In essence, a right to work state is a state that does not require workers to be affiliated with a union. So it's sort of not exactly in like, to me, the term right to work was always confusing. I mean, ultimately it just means right to work unimpeded by any obligations associated with a union. But that was a hard way of me explaining that some folks would argue that right to work actually is not necessarily in the best interest of the workers. And so in that sense, maybe we can understand why states that tend to lean more conservative politically tend also to be states that are less likely to compel the workers to join a union. If that makes sense. I apologize if I explained that very badly. I know we're not doing a Pear Deck here on YouTube, but one question that I'll leave you with is this. To what extent did the industrialization and growth of the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century improve the lives of the American people? Right? Where do we see innovation? Where do we see growth? Where do we see progress? And on the flip side, where do we see poverty? Where do we see suffering? Where do we see despair? And to what extent is that going to lead to the demand for reform moving forward? And with that, thanks so much for watching and take care.